Some killers make headlines that echo for decades. Others slip through history almost unnoticed, their crimes buried under time, geography, or silence. But make no mistake, the ones you've never heard of are often the most ruthless of all. In the 1950s, a jazz musician drifted along highways, luring families into his orbit before leaving them dead on the roadside. In Denmark, a woman entrusted with the care of infants turned her home into a house of death, killing children with a coldness that stunned even hardened judges. And more recently, a long-haul trucker prowled Europe's roads for decades, using his job as cover to strangle women from one country to the next, hiding in plain sight while authorities struggled to connect the dots. These are three killers most people have never heard of, but after today, you won't forget them. And please subscribe now and tell me in the comments, where you watching from? In the late 1950s, the highways that stretched across Virginia and Maryland carried families heading toward small towns, soldiers returning from bases, and travelers looking for a quiet life after the turbulence of the Second World War. To most, those roads represented freedom, but to Melvin David Reese, they were hunting grounds. Reese was, on the surface, an ordinary man, even respectable in the eyes of many. Born in 1928, he grew up in a conventional home, intelligent and musically gifted, eventually becoming a talented jazz musician who could charm crowds with his performances on the saxophone. By day, he moved through the world with the air of a man who had culture and artistry in his veins. But by night, he carried a darkness few could imagine. Behind the cool, smooth image of a musician was a predator driven by violent fantasies and a need for control. His double life is what made him so dangerous. To strangers, he was the kind of man who blended in with ease, yet to those who crossed his path under the wrong circumstances, he was the end of the road. Reese began drifting along highways, haunting rural towns and isolated stretches of road where travelers were most vulnerable. His first suspected murder was in 1957, when a young woman named Margaret Harold was found shot in her car on a back road in Virginia, her boyfriend tied up nearby and helpless to intervene. The killing seemed random, but investigators noted the cruelty, the careful staging, and the odd composure of the crime. For a time, it was treated as an isolated tragedy, but it was only the beginning. Reese had discovered that killing gave him a sense of power he had never felt on stage, a thrill that went far beyond the applause of a crowd. Over the next few years, he escalated, moving through small towns like a phantom, targeting women and sometimes entire families. His most infamous crime came in 1959, when the Jackson family, Carol, his wife Mildred, and their two daughters, vanished while driving home. Days later, their bodies were found in shallow graves, their car abandoned, and the brutality shocked even hardened investigators. What unsettled authorities most was not just the murders, but the calculated coldness behind them. Unlike many killers of his era, Reese did not act in frenzy. He planned, controlled, and carried out his crimes with an eerie patience. The press later nicknamed him the Sex Beast, but in reality, his terror went far deeper than any lurid headline could capture. Reese thrived in obscurity, blending music, travel, and murder into one life. A man whose saxophone played in smoky clubs, while families along the highways never made it home. The disappearance of the Jackson family in 1959 marked a turning point in the hunt for Melvin Reese, because their deaths revealed not only the scale of his violence, but also the calculated way he carried it out. Carol Jackson, his wife Mildred, and their two daughters vanished on a drive home from visiting relatives in Maryland. At first, police believed it might be a case of a family gone astray, an accident, or even a domestic matter. But within days, their bodies were discovered buried in shallow graves, the crime scene pointing to a predator who had complete control over his victims. Carol had been shot, Mildred brutally assaulted, and the two young girls strangled. The brutality was undeniable, yet what struck investigators was the almost casual manner in which the family had been dispatched, as though Reese viewed them less as human beings and more as objects in a grim performance. Detectives struggled to find leads in a time before forensic databases, DNA, or advanced profiling techniques. For months, the Jackson murders sat unsolved, joining the growing list of unexplained killings and disappearances along rural highways in Virginia and Maryland. Reese, meanwhile, continued his double life. By day, he played saxophone in jazz clubs, carrying himself with the charisma of a performer. By night, he prowled back roads, searching for vulnerable targets. He kept trophies from his crimes, including written notes that revealed his twisted fantasies and his obsession with exerting total control. What eventually cracked the case was not cutting-edge science, but persistence and luck. Investigators revisited the 1957 murder of Margaret Harold, noting similarities in method and geography. Witness accounts placed a strange, intense-looking man with a musician's lifestyle near both scenes. In 1960, police finally connected Reese to the crimes when they searched his home and uncovered a chilling stash of evidence. Firearms that matched the ballistic patterns from the murders, notebooks filled with grotesque writings about domination and killing, and even personal items belonging to his victims. The discovery shocked even seasoned investigators because it revealed a man who had not acted in a blind frenzy, but who carefully chronicled his fantasies, almost as though he saw himself as the author of his own horror story. In 1961, Melvin Reese was arrested and charged with multiple murders. In court, he appeared calm, almost smug, as though the trial were just another stage and the jury his audience. But the evidence was overwhelming. The man who once charmed audiences with his saxophone now faced the full weight of the law, exposed as a drifter who turned highways into killing fields and families into casualties of his darkness. When Melvin David Reese finally stood trial in 1961, the public was confronted with a man who seemed almost entirely disconnected from the horror he had inflicted. Reporters described him as calm, articulate, and eerily composed, a killer who showed no visible remorse even as prosecutors laid out the carnage of his crimes. The jury heard how he had murdered Margaret Harold in 1957, a random killing that revealed his appetite for control and cruelty, and how that violence had escalated with the Jackson family in 1959, a crime so ruthless that it shocked the region into silence. Evidence from his home painted the portrait of a man who not only killed, but delighted in the intellectual fantasy of murder. His notebooks, filled with bizarre and grotesque musings, read like manifestos of domination, where women and families were reduced to objects to be destroyed at will. The sheer coldness of his writings unsettled even hardened investigators. At trial, the defense attempted to raise questions about his mental state, but the prosecution pressed the narrative of a calculating predator who understood full well the difference between right and wrong. The jury agreed. Reese was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, later receiving the death penalty for additional convictions. To this day, he remains a largely forgotten figure in American crime history, overshadowed by more infamous killers of the era. Yet for those who remember the case, he was one of the most ruthless, blending charm, music, and brutality into a life that turned highways into hunting grounds. The story of Melvin Reese shows how evil can lurk behind the face of someone who seems cultured, even charismatic. A reminder that the surface of respectability often conceals unimaginable darkness. And while America was grappling with the terror left behind by the so-called sex beast across the Atlantic, Denmark faced its own chilling nightmare. There, a woman who was entrusted with the care of infants turned out to be one of the most prolific child killers in European history. Her name was Dagmar Overby, and her crimes shook an entire nation, exposing how trust itself can become the deadliest weapon in the hands of a predator. In the early decades of the 20th century, when Denmark was still a country shaped by poverty, war, and social upheaval, families who could not care for their children often turned to wet nurses or caretakers to help raise their infants. It was a system built on trust, mothers leaving their babies with women they believed would nurture and protect them. But for some, that trust became a death sentence. At the center of one of Denmark's most disturbing criminal cases was a woman named Dagmar Overby, a caretaker who turned her home into a place of quiet horror. Born in 1887, Dagmar lived an unremarkable life on the surface, blending into her Copenhagen neighborhood as a middle-aged woman who offered services to struggling mothers. She advertised herself as someone who would take in infants whose parents, often unmarried or impoverished, could not raise them. This was not unusual at the time. Society's shame toward unwed mothers and the grinding reality of poverty created a steady demand for caretakers like her. But behind the closed doors of Dagmar's home, babies entrusted to her care were never safe. Between 1913 and 1920, she murdered as many as 25 children, including one of her own. The methods she used were horrifying in their simplicity: strangulation, drowning, or leaving the infants to suffocate. To her, the babies were not lives to be nurtured, but burdens to be disposed of, and she carried out the killings with a chilling detachment that stunned authorities when the truth emerged. What made Dagmar especially terrifying was how ordinary she appeared. Neighbors described her as quiet, even helpful, never suspecting the horrors happening inside her home. In a world where caretakers were seen as saviors to desperate mothers, she became the ultimate betrayal, a predator who exploited trust in the most intimate and devastating way possible. By the time she was caught, Dagmar Overby had become one of history's most ruthless female killers, though her story remains almost unknown outside Denmark. The discovery of Dagmar Overby's crimes came slowly, like the unraveling of a nightmare that no one wanted to believe was real. For years, mothers had entrusted their infants to her care, often unmarried women who feared the stigma of raising a child alone, or families who were too poor to provide for another mouth. Many of these women never saw their babies again, but in a society where infant mortality was tragically high, they accepted the caretaker's vague explanations: sickness, sudden death, or even the claim that she had placed the child with another family. Dagmar relied on this silence, exploiting the shame and vulnerability of mothers who had little power to question her. But in 1920, one desperate mother refused to accept her evasions. She pressed for answers about her missing child, and suspicion fell on Dagmar. Authorities searched her home, and what they found confirmed their darkest fears. Evidence emerged that Dagmar had systematically killed infants entrusted to her, sometimes by strangling them with her own hands, other times by drowning them in buckets of water, or leaving them to suffocate in rags. Neighbors were horrified, not only by the crimes themselves, but by the realization that they had lived alongside her, spoken with her, perhaps even praised her for taking in children, never knowing the truth. When she was arrested, Dagmar confessed to murdering 25 infants, though she was ultimately charged with 9 deaths, as those were the cases prosecutors could prove beyond doubt. Her trial became one of Denmark's most infamous, a shocking spectacle that forced the nation to confront not only the ruthlessness of one woman, but also the societal conditions that had allowed her to operate unchecked. Newspapers described her with words usually reserved for demons or monsters, painting her as a figure beyond humanity. Yet, in court, she appeared ordinary, calm, composed, even maternal in demeanor. a fact that made her crimes all the more incomprehensible. Testimony revealed her detachment. She killed not in fits of rage, but with cold regularity, often explaining the deaths as if she had simply disposed of unwanted items. For the Danish public, the case shattered their fragile trust in a system where caretakers held the lives of children in their hands, and it left a scar that lingered for decades, even as her name faded into obscurity outside of her homeland. When Dagmar Overby's trial concluded in 1921, Denmark had been forced to confront the reality that one of the nation's own had become a predator of children, exploiting society's most vulnerable. The courtroom proceedings painted a portrait of a woman who seemed utterly detached from the enormity of her crimes. Witnesses testified to her calm demeanor, her matter-of-fact explanations, and her disturbing insistence that she was simply relieving mothers of burdens they could not carry. Prosecutors argued that she was a calculating murderer who betrayed trust for her own twisted convenience. In the end, the court convicted her of 9 murders, though her own confession suggested the true number was closer to 25. She was sentenced to death, an extraordinary punishment in Denmark at the time, but her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, where she remained until her death in 1929. For many, the commutation was an outrage. How could a woman responsible for the deaths of so many infants be allowed to live, even behind prison walls? Yet others believed that life in prison, stripped of freedom and condemned to obscurity, was its own form of justice. Dagmar's legacy left Denmark scarred. Parents became more suspicious of caretakers, and the case forced the government to impose stricter regulations on childcare. Though for the families who had lost children to her cruelty, no reform could undo the devastation. Over time, her story faded, overshadowed by wars, politics, and more famous killers who came to dominate headlines in other countries. But in the annals of European crime, Dagmar Overby remains one of the most ruthless female murderers in history, a reminder that trust can be weaponized in the most horrifying ways, and as chilling as her crimes were, they belonged to a time when poverty and secrecy created the perfect cover for murder. Decades later, in a modern Europe of highways, borders, and long-distance trade, another predator emerged who found cover not in superstition or silence but in mobility. Volker Eckert, a long-haul truck driver from Germany, used his job to roam across the continent, killing women in one country and crossing into another before authorities could even connect the crimes. Where Dagmar killed children left in her care, Eckert hunted sex workers along Europe's highways, hiding his crimes in the blur of endless miles and border crossings. For decades, the vast highways of Europe carried goods from one country to another, linking cities and economies while giving drivers long, lonely hours behind the wheel. Among the thousands of truckers hauling freight across borders in the late 20th century was a man named Volker Eckert, a German driver whose outward life seemed ordinary, a man doing a tough, solitary job that demanded endurance and discipline. But behind the steering wheel of his truck, Eckert concealed a darkness that stretched back to his childhood, one that would transform the freedom of Europe's highways into hunting grounds. Born in Plauen, East Germany, in 1959, Eckert grew up isolated and troubled. As a child, he developed a fascination with strangulation after he accidentally witnessed the hanging of a neighbor, a sight that etched itself into his mind and twisted into a lifelong obsession. By his teenage years, he was already acting on these urges, strangling women with his bare hands, though in East Germany's rigid, closed society, much of his early violence escaped serious attention. After serving time for an attempted killing in the 1970s, he emerged into adulthood with his compulsions not diminished, but sharpened. When the Berlin Wall fell and borders opened, Eckert found the perfect cover for his desires: truck driving. The profession allowed him to roam across Germany, France, Spain, and beyond, moving from one red light district to the next, targeting sex workers who were often transient themselves, whose disappearances drew little official urgency. To them, Eckert seemed like just another client. To him, they were prey. He would lure women into his cab, strangle them, and in some cases keep their corpses for hours or days, photographing them to preserve his control, even after death. His cab became both a trap and a tomb, a moving crime scene that crossed borders before investigators could even connect the dots. By the 1990s and early 2000s, he had killed multiple women across several European countries. Yet authorities struggled to see the pattern because each murder appeared isolated, tied to the underworld of sex work that already left victims vulnerable to neglect. To police in France, a body by the roadside was a local crime. To investigators in Spain, another dead woman was a separate tragedy. Only later would they discover that all the cases bore the same hidden signature: the hands of Volker Eckert tightening around a throat inside the cab of his truck. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Volker Eckert drove his freight truck across Europe with a kind of freedom most could only imagine. Endless roads stretching through Germany, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Border checkpoints that rarely asked questions of professional drivers, and the solitude of a cab where no one could see what he carried. For Eckert, this lifestyle was the perfect camouflage for his killings. He targeted sex workers, women whose disappearances rarely triggered large-scale investigations, and whose transient lives made it difficult for authorities to connect patterns across nations. His methods were chillingly consistent. He would pick up women at truck stops or red light districts, lure them into his cab under the guise of paid encounters, then strangle them with his hands or improvised ligatures. He often lingered with their bodies afterward, sometimes keeping them inside his truck for hours, even days, before discarding them on remote roadsides, ditches, or wooded areas. In some cases, he photographed the corpses, arranging them as though they were still alive, his camera preserving the illusion of control long after death. Investigators would later uncover dozens of these photographs hidden among his personal belongings, stark evidence of a man who relived his crimes in solitude. The most disturbing aspect of Eckert's spree was how long it went undetected. Local police forces in different countries treated each murder as an isolated case, unaware that the same German trucker was driving through their jurisdictions carrying the same compulsion. The European Union's open borders, designed for efficiency and trade, inadvertently gave him a hunting ground that spanned thousands of miles. Victims turned up in Germany, Spain, France, and beyond, yet without a centralized database or consistent communication, law enforcement struggled to piece the puzzle together. By the early 2000s, whispers of a pattern began to surface. But it wasn't until 2006, after the murder of a 28-year-old Bulgarian sex worker in Spain, that investigators zeroed in on Eckert. His truck was identified near the scene, and when Spanish and German authorities collaborated, they realized he had been in the vicinity of multiple unsolved murders stretching back decades. The arrest that followed revealed a man who was not the ordinary trucker his colleagues had known, but a serial killer who had confessed to at least 5 murders, though evidence suggested many more. His logbooks, photographs, and travel records pointed to a pattern of killings across Europe, a map of violence that spanned nations and years. What horrified investigators most was not just the number of his victims, but the casual way Eckert described his crimes, as though he had been living with this compulsion his entire life, hidden in plain sight among the endless convoys of Europe's highways. When the investigation into Volker Eckert's trail of death finally came to light in 2006, European authorities realized they had been dealing with a predator who had taken advantage of every weakness in the system and in society for decades. The photographs discovered in his possession were not random souvenirs. They were catalogs of his obsession, carefully preserved reminders of control, of life extinguished at his hands. The discovery of his trophy collection, locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, scraps of clothing, proved to investigators that Eckert was not driven by impulse alone, but by ritual, by a need to keep each victim with him even after her body had been dumped along a roadside or in a ditch miles from where she had last been seen alive. When questioned, Eckert admitted to 5 murders with a chilling flatness, as if confessing to routine acts rather than unthinkable crimes. But investigators strongly suspected the number of his victims was much higher, possibly dozens, scattered across Germany, France, Spain, and other countries, their deaths forever written off as local tragedies because no one had seen the connecting thread until it was too late. What made him uniquely terrifying was how invisible he remained. To his colleagues in the trucking industry, he was just another driver, a man who kept to himself, punctual with his deliveries, ordinary in every respect. To the women who entered his cab, he was death disguised as a client. And to law enforcement, he was a nightmare made worse by the lack of centralized communication across borders. One country saw a single murder, another saw one more, and none realized they were staring at pieces of the same puzzle until years later. Yet before the world could hear the full accounting of his crimes, Eckert cut his own story short. In July 2007, as he sat in a German prison awaiting trial, he hanged himself with shoelaces, leaving behind a silence as cruel as the acts that defined his life. He denied families the chance to see him condemned in court, denied investigators the answers they needed to close dozens of cold cases, and denied the world a final reckoning with his crimes. His suicide turned his legacy into an unfinished ledger, his true victim count forever hidden behind the endless roads he traveled. Volker Eckert will never be as infamous as the names that dominate serial killer lore, but perhaps that is what makes him most chilling. He was the proof that the most ruthless killers don't need infamy. They need only opportunity, invisibility, and the silence of those who never thought to look twice at an ordinary man behind the wheel of a truck. His story closes the chapter on this trio of forgotten predators, but it also leaves an unsettling question. How many others, just as obscure, have left their scars on history without ever being named? Some killers become infamous, their names etched into history, but others slip almost unnoticed, their ruthlessness hidden until the truth finally surfaces. Melvin Rees turned highways into hunting grounds. Dagmar Overby betrayed mothers who trusted her with their infants. Volker Eckert stalked Europe's roads for decades, his truck a moving coffin. 3 killers, 3 nightmares most people never heard of, until now. Subscribe and tell me in the comments which of these stories disturbed you most.